Hey guys, I'm super excited to share with you this interview on rider position, symmetry, and straightness. There are a ton of great tips for you to implement and take away. Be sure to comment below and let me know what your biggest takeaway is. Also, in the description, you will see a link to sign up for my free webinar on rider position that is going to be on May 16th. So check out the link. I'm really excited to see you on my free webinar. And rider position is so important. So I hope you get a lot out of this, and also subscribe to my channel. Give me a thumbs up. It really helps me out. And I hope you enjoy this interview. So hello, everyone. I'm super excited today because we have a very special guest. So we have with us Dr. Russell McKinney-Guire, and we are talking about rider symmetry and straightness. So as you all know, as dressage riders, straightness is a huge part of our training. And it's impossible for our horses to be straight if we are crooked. And believe it or not, we are all crooked, and so are our horses. So it's really important, first off, to identify your crookedness and asymmetries, understand how they affect your horse, and then figure out how to fix it. So I'm going to have Dr. Russell introduce himself and tell us a little bit about what he does with riders and the awesome shirt that he's designed to help you see your asymmetries. So I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, hi there, and thank you, Amelia, for that introduction, and thank you for asking me to come and just share some information. So I am Dr. Russell McKinney-Guire, and I'm based in the United Kingdom, in the middle of the country in a place called Warwickshire. We specialise in horse and rider performance analysis, and what that means is we do a lot of research looking at the interaction between the horse, saddle and rider, and vice versa. And you already mentioned there that horses are crooked, riders are crooked, and the saddle is basically the sandwich in the middle that has to manage the asymmetries from the horse and also the rider. So my passion really is trying to understand that scientifically. What effect does the rider have on the horse, and equally what effect does the horse have on the rider? And particularly interested in the saddle. The saddle is, as I say, this platform that the rider is sitting on. If the horse is asymmetric, the saddle then can become asymmetric, and the rider then somehow has to manage those two asymmetries. And that's where the work you're doing, Amelia, is brilliant in trying to help the rider be aware and looking at all the aspects that we're looking at. So that's myself. I'm a rider as well. I compete in dressage, jumping, and just very passionate about improving our understanding for the good of the horse, so we can improve equine welfare, health and performance across the globe. Hence why we are chatting today, because the more we can get the message out, the better for the horses.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And I think that Russell brings up like an interesting point, which is that there's kind of this system that happens when your horse is crooked and they make you crooked, and then you get more crooked and the horse gets more crooked, and so it's kind of this downward spiral, and it's really important to break that up. And you as the rider, I think, have to be the one that starts with like, okay, I'm going to get straight, and then now I'm going to make my horse straight under me.
100% agree with that, Amelia, because we as the rider have to make the decisions to try and influence the horse, whether that be training exercises to help the horse. But as you rightly say, let's start with looking at the rider on and off horse to see what we can do.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so Dr. Russell has created these amazing shirts, which I've used them in my videos. I'm sure you've seen them. So they're those black, they're called Visualized sportswear, black shirt with a X across the back of them. So can you describe to us, like, if you have the shirt or if you don't, the first thing that I look at when I sit on a horse, when I see a rider, is I look at that line that goes down your spine. And you want to see that that line is straight up and down and right above the horse's spine.
Yeah, so I designed these jackets, training shirts and jackets in 2009. And the main reason was because we generally ride in nice jackets, but they're quite baggy, certainly in the UK, or they're blouson type jackets. And as a coach, it is really hard to look at riders' position. So I was like, let's try and simplify the image that the coaches or rider is seeing. So we have now a snug jacket. And then I was like, okay, well, let's put some lines on it. And as you rightly said, you know, it's a very simple concept, but hugely effective in the sense that it has vertical and horizontal lines on the back and the front. And it also has lines going down the arm. So we can look at the, you know, for example, the elbow, wrist, bit line. But I generally use the lines at the back and the front, because we're simply, as you rightly said, is once in a static position, getting that central line in line with the horse's midline. And then during motion, how does the rider start to deviate? And I'm a big fan of video feedback. So riders can video, coaches can video, and use these jackets to help evaluate just for themselves what they're doing. And what we found in a study is you can look at the same image 10 times and get the same message. If you change the image once, your brain will pick up different things. So you could be crooked and not recognize it. And the minute you see a line going down, like crumbs, I'm quite crooked. And then you start to change the pathway, the patterning, and the messages to then try and correct your asymmetries.
Yeah, and I think that really brings up a good point, which is this idea of like proprioception, which is we all think we're straight. Like if you close your eyes and you're in front of a mirror and you're like, okay, I'm going to try to be straight. And then you open your eyes and you're not straight. So
Yeah.
it's trying to help us riders see that we're not crooked, because as a trainer, sometimes I'll tell my students like over and over again, you're crooked, you're not sitting straight. But until they see it, even if they're a good student, they have a hard time believing me or picturing that. So that's where this is a super valuable tool.
Yeah, and I think it's the same as like when you're helping people ride and they're leaning forwards and you say, now bring, you know, sit up, and they're like, oh my gosh, I'm leaning backwards. And it's just that proprioception, that feeling that one has, but actually they're sitting straight. So it's just trying to, as you say, change the image, change the message, change that feedback that the rider is experiencing.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay. So we've gotten on our horse, we're sitting, and always when I first get on, I tell my students, like, make sure your saddle's straight, and then make sure that you are sitting straight in the middle of the saddle. So at least that you start out well.
Yeah.
Oftentimes, if you get on and your saddle's not tight enough, your saddle goes off to the left. So it's always important to just like get your saddle straight, get your girth tight, get yourself in the middle of the saddle, and get that vertical line straight up and down. And then what about the line for the shoulders?
Yeah, so I think generally if the line is slightly off, then you've got the trunk leaning to one side. But what that usually is combined with is a collapse through that rib cage. So that line across the shoulders will drop down on the side of the collapse. So you end up with a rider leaning with their trunk, but also compressing down through their rib cage. And that will also generally 9 times out of 10 end up with the seat being shifted off to one side. And it usually actually starts from the seat and works its way up. If we think of building blocks, the pelvis is the first building block, and then we've got the rib cage, and then we've got the shoulders, and then the head. Well, if the first building block is off to the right, the instinct, our natural response is to find balance. So then we lean the opposite way. So we would see that with the line, the vertical line on the jacket being kinked, but also the horizontal line on the jacket being down on one side. So we haven't yet developed seat lines, but that would definitely show 9 times out of 10 that the seat is off to one side, generally the opposite side too.
Yeah, awesome. So the goal really is that this X on our back, we want it to stay perfectly straight and level, and there shouldn't be any deviations, no curved lines. And yeah.
I think the important thing to note here is riders really want to be looking at themselves on both reins, because you could be have this perfectly straight X on the left rein and then change rein and you could be crooked. And this is what we're really looking at now, is why are riders crooked on one rein and not the other. And generally that's they're weaker on one side or stronger on the other. The horse is pushing differently on one hind limb versus the other. So I think the effect that the direction has on the rider's body is something we really need to drill down in. So I think, yeah, we want the X to say fairly central, but also looking at both directions, both, we call it here diagonals, rising trot, you call it posting trot, I think, and looking at how you change between the diagonals in the posting trot.
Awesome. Yeah, so Russell and I were discussing earlier too, the most common thing that I see here in the US is I see riders that tend to collapse the right side. So their left shoulder's higher, their right shoulder's lower, and then they sit a little bit off to the left. And I find that this happens because most horses have a weaker right hind leg. And so they tend to drift into the right. They want to carry their right leg to the right. So the rider starts to curl up their right leg because they're trying to push the horse over from their right leg. And they end up like leaning over to the left and collapsing to the right. So I know you said that you find that opposite in the UK.
Yeah. So I think it really interesting observation, and I think, yeah, just as a generalization, we would generally find a different, the same pattern but reversed, with the rider's seat going slightly to the right, and then, as you rightly described, them shortening through their upper body and the left leg drawing up. Now, why? And it's about a 60-40 split, so it's not a huge, you know, we still see a lot of the other movement patterns that you described. But I really am interested in our lifestyle, what we do, how that influences our position. And like, I'm already now thinking, okay, what you do in the state, what the riders do in the States versus in the UK, is there a difference? And the one that springs to mind straight away is just driving. Does that have an effect? I don't know the answer, but I have my colleagues in Canada, Alison Pazak, and we started to explore this about 5-6 years ago. And I probably need to do a bit more on it, but I think it is super interesting when we start seeing these national trends. Are they trends, or are they just, is it just that you've got that group of observations and I've got this? So we need to do more research on it, but certainly what I think we're in agreement is that we see a lot of crooked riders, either to the left or to the right.
Yeah, but it's definitely important that if you find some kind of an asymmetry, that you need to think about how you're sitting in your car, how you sit at your desk, even how you sleep, because all of that affects your riding. And it's really important that you address your asymmetries when you're not in the saddle. So, you know, just trying to fix it when you're riding is not going to work. You need to do exercises, you need to change patterns in your life so that when you get on your horse that you're able to be straighter. Yeah. And then another thing that I find is really important and that helps my students is, like, when you're sitting on your horse and let's say your horse is crooked and your horse is pushing to the right, it's really important to try to like get your horse straight and then remind yourself to get straight, because a lot of times what riders do is they're like, oh, my horse is leaning to the right, and so they're working so hard to get their horse off of their right leg that they end up compensating and getting crooked themselves. So it's like, affect your horse and then sit straight, and then affect your horse and then sit straight.
Yeah, I really agree. I fully agree. I think I call that recalibrate. So have a correction for the horse, but then recalibrate yourself, and then eventually the two will become married up. What I find a lot of riders do in that scenario is actually, once the right leg in that case isn't working and they can't get the horse straight, is then they sometimes will resort for another strategy, which is the left rein, and then that creates, that's like a snowball effect, because then the horse's neck bends more to the left, shoulders fall more to the right, and then the rider then gets more crooked, so you get this effect. So I think you're absolutely right, this recalibration effect is really important. I was just going to add to what you were saying a moment ago about off-horse exercise for me is so underrated, and we really must, and I can't stress this enough, look at implementing it more in our training. And I'm a big fan of Pilates, yoga, physio interventions for all riders of all levels, because these animals can feel a fly. Why can they not feel a rider that's crooked? So if we can present the horse with a rider that can absorb the forces, stay in balance with the horse, and have very good baseline symmetry, that will help the horse manage his own inherent asymmetry. So I 100% echo what you said a moment ago, that we really need to look at riders as athletes, and like I say, working with them off the horse, looking at their own asymmetries.
Yeah, for sure. And I personally, I work with a physical therapist who comes to the barn. She watches me ride. She
Yeah.
sees where I'm crooked, and then I get off, and then she works with me, gives me exercises. Kind of, I have a bad left shoulder, so she helps me work through that. And until I started doing things off of the horse, like instructors would tell me like, oh, your left shoulder, but I would get frustrated being like, well, I'm trying to ride and I need to focus on my horse, and I have so many other things going on.
Yeah.
I can't focus on that. So that's where it's really important that you do exercises and like strengthen those muscles when you're not riding, so that when you're on the horse, it's much easier to like trigger that and get yourself straight.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more.
Okay, I want to talk a little bit about circles and turns, because I think that this is a place where I see a lot of riders lose their straightness and their symmetry. And one of the most common mistakes I see is that when you're turning, right, your shoulders should turn with your horse's shoulders. So if you're turning to the left, your left shoulder should come a little back, your right shoulder should come forward. And this also helps to put a little weight on your inside seat bone, which is helpful to help your horse turn.
Yeah.
So can you explain like what happens? A lot of riders can turn their shoulders one way and not the other way. So what happens when you go through a turn and you forget to turn your shoulders and your counter turned?
Yeah, and I see this observation a lot, and I think a lot of it's to do with the forces that are happening on the rider's pelvis, and generally they're either pulling the pelvis to the outside of the circle, especially at the faster gaits, and riders either collapse or they try and twist to try and counteract those forces. In terms of the horse, you've already mentioned it. If the rider is twisting the wrong way, they are signaling to the horse to go that way. So if we are on a left circle and our left shoulder in as advance and our body is pointing to the right, we are, through our mechanics, signaling to that horse to go to the right. But of course, you're going to the left. So what the rider will do is develop a strategy, and generally that comes to the hand, and they'd start overusing the inside rein, and possibly then gripping with that inside leg. So it really is quite important, as you mentioned, about keeping the weight to the inside to signal. That's the weight aid that signals to the horse that's the direction of travel, and that our body is aligned on top throughout the circle. So one of the things, I'm sure you do it as well, but it's to imagine you've got like a torch in your belly button or in your sternum, and you're just lighting up the way for the horse to travel. So if we're going to the left, it goes slightly to the left, or if we're going to the right, it goes slightly to the right. But I go back to what I said earlier. We've got to get the pelvis in the correct position and then stack everything on top. And I think it goes back to what you said a moment ago, Amelia. If we get the riders dynamically able to move their pelvis, then when they're on the horse, they should be able to follow the movement of the horse and not be pulled to the outside by the forces and therefore twisting on top.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where I think these jackets are really helpful, both for the rider and for the trainer, because it, like, when I've had my students wear the jacket, sometimes suddenly like I can see like, oh my gosh, like their shoulders are not turning at all. So it's really helpful for this visual aid with the X on the back to just be able to see that.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that I see that riders do sometimes in turns is they like lean to the side
Yeah.
to get their horse to turn.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, with the jackets and the lines, what I use all the time is when I've got a rider, say on the left circle, and they're rotating to the right, I say to them, "Can you see the line on the back of the jacket from the side?" Because they're that twisted, and they're like, "Yeah, yeah." And I was like, "We really shouldn't be able to see the line on the back. We want to see the lines on the front." And so I use the jackets in that way as a very simple tool, just to say, we really want to see the front of the body on the turn, not the back of the body. So that's a very useful way of doing that. And then to your second point about riders leaning in, this is a real concern for us, because if you were on my shoulders, Amelia, and then you leant to the left, I'm going to be like, "Whoa, Amelia, step left." So to the horse, their weight is then transferred to that inside, and the horse has then got to restabilize itself, rebalance itself, because the rider has collapsed dramatically to the inside. The reason we're really concerned at this is because what we've shown in a study is that actually can increase loading on the forelimbs and hind limbs in trot. So by the rider taking their center of mass over, causes asymmetries in the horse's movement. So especially on the circle, we already know that circling has asymmetries for the horse. So it's really, really important that riders try and stretch up through that inside rib cage, especially when, as you all know, especially when turning.
Yeah, awesome. And that brings up another huge point, which is that working on symmetry and straightness, both for the horse and for the rider, improves the longevity of your horse's career and of your career. So, if you're out of balance in your turn and your horse is on the forehand and tweaking their legs, they're not going to stay sound. And that's why it's really important that we focus on this symmetry and straightness so that your horse can have a long and injury-free career.
Yeah,
that's really
I agree with that. Our quest is really to try and reduce the risk of injury. Sadly, injuries do happen, and not saying that if we get you 100% symmetrical, that's going to stop any injury. But what we want to try and do is to reduce the risk factors, and being crooked and not addressing them is a risk factor. And some people, I think we should say, some riders are crooked through either injury or inherent asymmetries. And in those cases, that's absolutely fine. But what one must do then is look at strategies to help support the horse. And we mentioned earlier about physical therapists. I'm a big fan. To be a good rider requires a team around you. So your physio, as you mentioned, your farrier, your veterinarian, the rider physio, etc., all trying to help manage these factors. And in this case, it's rider asymmetry, but there's lots of other factors which collectively we can work together on.
awesome. Thank you for that. Okay, so one more place that I see a lot of asymmetries come up is the canter. And the canter, as we know, it's like the one gait where you have a left lead and a right lead. So it's kind of an asymmetrical gait. And again, a lot of times what I see in the canter is that the horse, especially like a young horse or a green horse, the horse will kind of want to lean a little to the inside and push the rider to the outside. So obviously in the canter, you want to be sitting a little more on the inside seat bone. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I think, yes, of course. I think you're absolutely right. Canter obviously is an asymmetrical gait, and it's a free beat gait, and it's a rocking gait as well, so from back to front. And so in terms of what you're describing there's a lot more force coming up in the canter that the rider's got to manage. So if the horse is naturally crooked for whatever reason, then the rider's got to, one, manage the horse's crookedness, but also manage the forces that are coming up from the horse's limbs. And so that's why I think riders end up falling to that outside. And it goes back again to what we've already discussed, that if we can present the horse with a rider that can manage those forces and also react to those forces, then they will be able to to affect the horse positively, i.e. using their outside leg, maybe a little bit of leg yield off the outside if the horse is experienced enough. What we don't want to do is have a rider that's in that situation and they are just trying to balance and stay on and keep canter, because then they're not being effective at trying to improve the horse. So I think canter is one of the easiest gaits, but also one of the hardest gaits to try and influence try and correct the rider's position, because there's so much going on. And I really can't emphasize enough, let's get off the horse, get dynamically stable, and then translate that onto the horse. But one of the things, if you are really struggling in canter and you're on a large circle, is one of the things I quite like to do is just get my riders to look over their outside shoulder, and that just transfers the weight back to the inside seat bone. But then what we must make sure is that we haven't got a twist. So then the rider needs to then address the rotation in the upper body.
Oh yeah, that's good. I like that. So like when you're cantering, look a little to the outside, and that helps to
just for
your,
one, yeah, just for one or two strides, and then open that. So if we're on a left canter and I'm falling to the right, I'd look over the right shoulder, open my left hip knee so my weight can transfer down into the left inside stirrup, and then correct my upper body alignment, and then try and just get that feedback into the position that we want to stay to the left or to the inside. And what a lot of people will end up doing then is, to achieve that, is they drop the shoulders.
yeah.
Obviously not what we want to do. But I can't emphasize enough, the forces that are coming up from the horse's limbs are high, and the rider has to manage that, or the saddle and the rider has to manage that. In canter, the forces coming down on the horse's back is 2.5 times the rider's body mass. So if the rider is crooked, you can work out that that mass is then loaded crooked. So there's so many things interacting that. So if we can just break it down and get the rider in a better position, that would be advantageous.
Yeah, awesome. And the other thing that I see happen in the canter, like you're talking about this rocking motion and the forces, is that lots of times riders take that into their shoulders. Well, they start like doing a shimmy in their shoulder, or you see the nice X on the back of the jacket will start like waving and doing all these crazy things. So I always tell my students, like, try to think about keeping your shoulders still and then let your hips kind of swing and absorb the motion of the canter.
And I think there's the key word there, is again going back to the building blocks. We've got the pelvis, the ribs, the shoulders, the head. Is the reason we see a lot of this rotation or rocking is because fundamentally the pelvis is not absorbing forces, so the forces have to go somewhere. So if we've got a pelvis that is fairly rigid and not really able to move forwards and backwards and side to side, then the rider will compensate with this what we call axial rotation. So again, if we can get the pelvis more mobile, off horse and on horse, like I'm a big fan of no stirrups work, not necessarily lots of it, but just a couple of minutes just to try and lengthen the leg to get the pelvis to swing a bit more, and that then will over time help the canter as well.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, so I had a question about like saddle fit. So let's say that you have a saddle that's not sitting straight. Obviously, I mean, that's going to have a huge impact on your horse, and you need to have a saddle fitter come out. Do you recommend that people like asymmetrically flock their saddles to get them straight, or kind of how do you approach trying to get the saddle straight? Because once you asymmetrically flock it, then it kind of lends itself to not getting the horse straight.
I think that's a really good question, and we could spend a whole day on that one topic. And I can only really speak from the UK because obviously that's where I'm based. But in this country, we have qualified saddle fitters, which and you have in the States. So the first thing we've got to do is work with our qualified saddle fitter and have a static and dynamic saddle fit done to assess the fit of the saddle. Now, some saddles do slip to one side, and in those cases, what we've shown in the research is we've actually used shims, which are 5-10 millimeter thick medical grade closed cell foam, and they're positioned under various parts of the saddle to try and help rebalance the saddle. There's also girthing arrangements. So if the saddle slips to the right, you may use the first and third or fourth strap on the left and the first two on the right. And vice versa, you might do different girthing on the other side. So there's lots of different things you can do. To answer your question about asymmetrically flocking, this would be at the decision of the qualified saddle fitter. Now, I do know some cases where they do that, and that's largely based because the horse has an asymmetry. And that asymmetry is apparent over time. So then they do look at asymmetrically flocking the saddles. But I would say from our work here is that if you go down that route, it is both routes, it is so important you have that saddle checked regularly by that qualified saddle fitter. The horse's back changes within 30 minutes of exercise. It changes dramatically with the seasons, so going into winter versus summer, or fall versus the summer. So it's so important if you have a saddle that does roll left and right to have it checked regularly to keep it in balance.
Yeah, for sure. And it's like saddle fit and having a good saddle is a huge part about symmetry and straightness, because when your saddle's crooked and you're always fighting that, it makes it so hard. Like I even find sometimes when my saddle's crooked, like I'll be sitting straight above the horse, but the saddle's crooked, and that is still so bad for the horse, because what happens is that the panels of the saddle are then sitting on your horse's spine, and that's incredibly uncomfortable for them. So it's really important that that saddle sits straight and not on the horse's spine.
Yeah, absolutely. So if the saddle goes to the right, you'll end up with pressure down the left side of the horse's back, up close to the spine, the midline. It also affects limb loading of the horse's body or limbs. And then the rider usually will collapse or do what you've just described, be sitting in straight but not in the middle of the saddle, which is uncomfortable and ineffective. And saddle slip is really important. Generally only happens on one rein. So if a saddle goes to the right, it's the left rein that will be more apparent on. If it goes to the left, it would be the right rein. And at the beginning of this interview, I said it's so important that we look at riders on both the left and right rein. So in that case, the rider that's got a saddle slip to the right will look quite crooked on the left rein, but on the other rein, they might look straight. So it's really important that we look at these. Why is it happening? How can we help it? And then what should we do thereafter?
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I think that gives us like a lot of stuff to think about. And I think the biggest takeaway is just, first of all, identify your crookedness. And then as you go through your ride, check in with it again. Anytime something gets hard or you're trying to fix your horse, fix your horse, and then check in with yourself, check in with your saddle fit, like have some video taken. That's always super helpful. And so where can people find out more about you, Russell?
So follow us on Facebook, Centaur Biomechanics, that's my company. Also have a look at our website, and you're also, for the jackets, Visualized Canada with Alison Pazak. She ships over in Canada and America. So have a look on social media for contacts, and thank you for having me.
Awesome. So I will put the links below to where you can find out more about Dr. Russell, and then also where you can purchase the shirts. I do have them now on my store, so I will put that link below if you're interested in purchasing a shirt. And we'll also link down there some more videos for you guys to watch if you want to learn more. But I really hope that this has helped you guys come up with some ideas to get you and your horse straighter, because it's a big part of dressage, and it's important that you address it from the rider's perspective and don't blame it all on your horse, because it's our fault too. So we always have to work on our own symmetry and straightness.
Yeah, absolutely. 100% echo that.
Well, thank you so much. That was super educational, and I'm sure everyone is grateful for your time. And yeah, that's it for today. So thank you guys. Thank you, Russell.
Thank you. Bye-bye.